Chapter 6. Memory, Narrative, and Identity. Quote, "You are a story you tell yourself about yourself." End quote. In this chapter, I will discuss how the neurological structure of human memory causes us to create narratives. These narratives produce our past, our roles, and by extension, our identities. Pragmatic Magical Thinking is a useful toolset for becoming aware of these narratives and playing with them in order to produce real-world effects. Previously, I've explained how our attention radically affects our opportunities and ability to avoid pitfalls. In this chapter, I will discuss how our mental framing also affects the way the world presents itself to us, and therefore affects what we can and can't get away with. How memory works. In the modern world, it's common to compare our brains to hard drives that store memories. It is as if one day we might be able to reach inside a brain and be able to download everything that makes up that person. This tantalizing yet scary idea has been explored in science fiction, such as the TV show Red Dwarf or the classic anime Ghost in the Machine. Despite first appearances, a closer look into the science of memory shows that things aren't that simple, and such fantasies are a long way off. Memory storage in the human brain is not as similar to computer data as some might hope. Human brains store memories in an incomplete fashion. Current neuroscience suggests that if one was capable of reading the information that is stored in the brain, one wouldn't find anything like a model of the person's experiences. Instead, we store only the amount necessary in order to reconstruct a memory when triggered by outside stimulus or state of mind. What's more, memories are not things. They are processes. A group of neurons can contain multiple memories. When one has an experience, a group of neurons will fire in a particular pattern. When one remembers the experience, the neurons will fire in a strikingly similar pattern, and the moment can be re-experienced. We are constantly walking around experiencing and re-experiencing things. If magic is the manipulation of perception in accordance with the will, as I have described earlier, then our memory creates a fertile ground for magic. Many memories only come back to us when they receive the appropriate stimulus. Otherwise, these types of memories can remain locked away as if we have lost the keys to the filing cabinet. In psychology, memories that require this extra stimulus are called context-dependent memories and state-dependent memories. In these cases, the conditions of the environment or the state of mind that was present during the learning process also needs to be present in order for us to retrieve the memory. A common example of this context-dependent memory is when we leave a room to get something done and immediately forget what it is we wanted to do. Only returning to the room seems to restore the forgotten memory. It's as if the thought was left behind in that space. The only way to retrieve it seems to be to go back into the room where the memory is and collect it again. It is my strong suspicion that what is really happening is that there is some external trigger in the room that caused us to have the thought in the first place. The trigger will usually be something we sensed in the environment. However, we only experience the thought the trigger produces, and we don't always notice the trigger itself. Magicians have exploited this phenomena using memory theaters, also known as methods of loci. These are imagined environments that are created to hold the keys to unlock many memories. This type of technique can push the normally forgetful human mind beyond its normal limitations and enable practitioners to retain and recall huge lists of terms. This is quite an ancient method that dates back at least as far as Cicero's De Oratore, an ancient Roman dialogue from 55 BC. This very phenomenon of context-dependent memory can be used by stage mentalists such as the famed Darren Brown to manipulate a volunteer from the audience to uttering a pre-selected phrase or drawing a predetermined picture preordained by the magician. The victim of the trick believes that they are coming up with a random phrase or picture, but they have been psychologically conditioned by unconscious memory triggers to recall an exact idea that was chosen by the mentalist. This is not an easy task to pull off and requires a scripted setup as well as visual and verbal cues that play on the senses. It works so well because most of us believe that the ideas we have always come from our own minds. Frequently, however, they don't. We are just unconscious of the external source, trigger, or influence. Carl Jung, the pioneering psychoanalyst and magician, said, "You don't have ideas. Ideas have you." This is the same underlying principle behind subliminal advertising. A Coca-Cola sign might be recognized unconsciously. As a result, by psychological conditioning, the target will remember the experience of drinking a Coke and desire one. They will remember the sensation, but not always recall seeing the sign that triggered it. Afterwards, they will tell themselves that they made a decision to purchase a Coke of their own free will. For our purposes, I consider this effect real magic. Quote, "Studies suggest that the characteristics of the environment are encoded as part of the memory trace and can be used to enhance retrieval of the other information in the trace." End quote. That was from a study by Maston, 2010. If you'd like the footnotes, please purchase my book. The most famous study of context-dependent memory is the 1975 scuba diver experiment. That was D.R. Godin and A.D. Baddeley. Divers were asked to remember a list of terms, both above water and underwater. When asked to remember the information, the divers remembered best when they were asked in the same environment that they memorized the list in. Again, it's as if the memories were left in the location. This can be problematic for those who need to practice for a performance or an exam, as there is no way to practice in the exam room itself. One way around this is to try and practice in more than one location so that the memory becomes detached from the scenery and is more easily retrieved under pressure. As a professional musician and guitar teacher, I have noticed that I often have to pick up a guitar in order to remember a song. My students have often mentioned this as well. It can feel as if the memory is in the guitar, because the interaction with the guitar offers the stimulus to bring forth the memory. For non-musician music lovers, a similar phenomenon can be experienced by trying to remember the lyrics of a favorite song. Often the entire song must be sung through in order to retrieve the lyrics that are, for example, in the third verse. I remember as a child trying to sort items in alphabetical order and having to sing the entire alphabet song from beginning every time in order to remember where a particular letter was placed. At the time, I felt perplexed by the inefficiency of my own memory. You can work this type of magic yourself. Try choosing a place that you frequent, such as a landmark somewhere along your daily travels. Purposefully assign a memory to that particular landmark. For instance, a favorite tree might be assigned to a positive childhood memory. You can use this mind hack to landmark important reminders in places where they will be relevant. Maybe a pot plant just outside your house will store a trigger to check your pockets for your phone so you don't leave it behind. Start playfully. Try it with a willing friend or family member. Similarly to context-dependent memory, state-dependent memories happen when a state of mind such as a mood is encoded with a memory and that state is required for recall. Being angry makes it more likely that you will remember other times you were angry. Being sad makes it more likely that you will remember other times you were sad. This can have an impact on whether these states of mind lead to habits. It is also why emotional states of mind can create a kind of momentum that can be hard to shift. Once angry, it takes some effort to come back down to calmness, perhaps in part because of the flood of angry memories. If you often feel the world is plotting against you, then you might have formed such a state-dependent thought habit. Being aware of this phenomenon might be the first point of leverage to shift the unwelcome habit. Quote, "A person in a gloomy mood is more likely to recall gloomy information. A person in a happy mood is more likely to remember cheerful information. Patients with clinical depression have been found to recall more negatively focused information than non-depressed controls." That's from the study by Goddard, 2012. If you'd like the footnotes, please purchase the book. Studies have also been done with stress hormones such as epinephrine, showing that particular memories can also be attached to the hormonal state. Quote, "Extensive evidence suggests that stress hormones, such as epinephrine, play a critical role in consolidating new memories, and this is why stressful memories are recalled vividly." Studies by Gold and Van Buskirk provided initial evidence for this relationship when they showed that injections of epinephrine into subjects following a training period resulted in greater long-term retention of task-related memories. This study also provided evidence that the level of epinephrine injected was related to the level of retention, suggesting that the level of stress or emotionality of the memory plays a role on the level of retention. That's from James L. McGaugh and Benno Rudzendahl, 2012. Whilst changing one's emotional habits is certainly no walk in the park, understanding how state-dependent memory can create a kind of emotional momentum gives us an angle of control we might not have had before. If it's something you want to try, I recommend starting in a frivolous fashion rather than on something too serious. Perhaps a morning coffee and the associated caffeine rush can be willfully attached to a reminder to let go of yesterday's stress and focus on starting a new day with a blank slate. For these reasons and more, I don't believe it is exactly accurate to say that memory is entirely in the brain. I think it is clear that memory is an interaction with the environment. This environment includes the human body, the places the body inhabits, as well as communication and social interaction with other people. When we write a shopping list, we are externalizing our memory into the environment. The books, movies, songs, and other media that we interact with are also our memory triggers, and are as necessary for what is expected of us in the world as that which is contained within our skulls. Just as bees function as a hive, as well as individually, our externalized memory functions like an extension of our individual brains. Our memory has evolved to work with these external stores and reminders. If one was to take a human away from all these triggers, it would result in a lessening of their self. One not so pleasant way to look into this is with research accounts of prisoners held in solitary confinement, dark, lonely rooms that cause sensory deprivation. Not only does the mental health of these subjects deteriorate rapidly, but their brain starts to invent triggers to compensate, which can result in the hallucinations sometimes referred to as prisoner's cinema. This is usually described as a series of dancing lights, or phosphenes, that appear in front of the eyes out of the darkness, generated by the observer's own visual cortex. But it can also progress into full hallucinations. A safer and more enjoyable way to try this is with a sensory deprivation tank. Friends who have tried this have reported to me very odd and sometimes psychedelic experiences. The power of narrative. In Merlin Donald's fantastic book, A Mind So Rare, he explains that our memories of experiences are laid out in small chunks, each of which never exceeds about 15 seconds of actual time. Ponder that. All of your memory of past events is like many momentary stepping stones. We join these remembered moments together like a join-the-dots puzzle to create narratives which we think of as our past. This process requires creativity, and the way we frame and connect these moments is alterable after the fact. This momentary stepping stone memory also explains why memories can change over time. Often future experiences can radically reconfigure a past memory. Therefore, our remembered past is not as fully fixed as we might expect. For example, one might have a childhood memory in which Santa Claus visited the family home one Christmas. Later, the memory might be reconfigured when one realizes that a particular uncle was missing from the room, only to reappear later after Santa had left. The narrative can change the context of the memory. New stories can rewrite the past. The narratives we create to join these gaps inform our identity. The ego plays a part. We often reconfigure the past in order to point out what a fine fellow we are, or to support our cognitive biases. History, on a much grander scale, is also a joining of the dots. Usually the historian looks at the available evidence in order to line up events in accordance with their pet narrative. An entertaining and exaggerated example of this can be seen with conspiracy theories, such as the moon landing hoaxes or chemtrail enthusiasts. This joining of the dots can be stretched and shaped to absurd levels. All history suffers to some degree from this uncertainty, and conspiracy theories are only an extreme example, not the exception. The power of roles. A collection of personal narratives, supported by an individual's past and their projected future, can be generalized into a role. A role is a subpersonality within an individual, with its own drives, values, and even its own beliefs, which we will explore in the next chapter. Roles are acted out in the world and interact with other roles. These roles allow us to frame the interactions we have with other people so that we can more easily understand each other's behavior, what is expected of us, and make better predictions as to how a person will behave. Without these roles, we wouldn't be able to track such relationships as friend or foe, buyer or seller, or parent and child. Each of us has multiple roles, and these various roles inform what we can get done in the world. For example, a particular woman might spend some of her time in the role of a mother and another part in the role of a saleswoman. As a mother, the nurturing protection of her children might seem quite contradictory to the salesperson's view of people as opportunities to earn commission. In the mother role, the children ought to be encouraged into their independent selfhood. In the sales role, other people must often be reduced to an opportunity to score sales. It is normal for human beings to have different roles that have contradictory values. The term cognitive dissonance has been used to describe two or more sets of values that are at odds with each other, causing stress in the individual. I would like to propose that most of the time we live in cognitive harmony. That is, we are able to compartmentalize our values in such a way that they don't conflict, even if they contradict. A nurse may behave as a nurse whenever they wear their uniform, and in that role they must care for their patients. Their uniform will necessitate a certain code of conduct, and others will have certain expectations of anybody wearing that uniform. Later, the nurse might come home, change into black clothes, go to a band practice, and become a death metal singer who sings enthusiastically about violence. The ritual of shedding one costume for another keeps one role from interfering with the other. If you have cognitive dissonance between the values expressed by one role and another, try forming a ritual to compartmentalize each role. Perhaps you can treat the front door of your house as a magical portal which sheds you of your job stress as soon as you walk through it. Maybe have a container next to your front door in which you place your work phone so that you can leave the work role behind and embrace the homekeeper's role. My friend Alice Flett once told me of a story about a time when she was working with a difficult boss. Rather than letting her worries pollute her free time, she would meditate on the image of putting her boss in an imaginary chest and then throwing away the key. Rituals such as graduation ceremonies, christenings, initiations, or the wearing of badges or name tags, or the carrying of a clipboard can have a big effect not only on a person's own mindset, but also in the way they are treated by other people. Sometimes, such as is the case with a police person's uniform, these rituals can be legalized. That is, a uniformed cop has certain legal responsibilities to uphold that they may shed when the uniform is taken off. In other cases, the rules are unwritten, but the effects are just as real. In future chapters, I will explore the magical implications of this line of thinking in much more depth. Archetypes, the mythological role. Many roles have cross-cultural universality. The psychoanalyst and magician Carl Gustav Jung and his followers termed these roles archetypes. A good introduction to these archetypes can be found in Joseph Campbell's TV series, The Power of Myth, which came out in 1988, or his famous book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, 1949. Archetypes such as the wise man, the hero, the villain, the trickster, the maiden, the mother, or the warrior pop up again and again in our stories. They are patterns of meaning that have specific tasks or values, yet they are still general enough that we can find them in universal examples throughout media, from journalism to fiction to our own behavioral patterns. This is similar to the red Toyota Corolla syndrome I've described in earlier chapters. As ethologists point out, even animals can express archetypes. Archetypes can be symbolic, biological, and social. They underlie the things that people find important. So any story, including a news report, is necessarily going to draw from archetypes. They can be thought of as an ordering structure for roles. Depending on one's chosen framework, archetypes can range from few to numerous. As with most creative thinking, it's not so important whose structure we adopt as what we do with that structure and the results it produces. Archetypes can be considered instinctual behaviors that we act out. Typical human experiences that may shape our lives consciously or unconsciously. Feeling like you are on a crusade is identification with the hero archetype. Feeling ostracized is identification with the outsider archetype. We can read about these types of characters and use them to frame our own behavior. Such is the many-layered nature of the human condition. For the sake of a very brief introduction, here are a few of the more central archetypes that Carl Jung discussed. The self. This is the central archetype which structures our identity. We project the self onto people and the characters we want to be like through identification, empathy, and solidarity. The self is the inner part of you that observes your interactions. the shadow. Anything as yet unrealized by consciousness, as well as all the parts of ourselves we don't like to look at. The shadow often reveals itself through the imagined intentions we project onto others. Carl Jung maintained that discovering our shadow and consolidating it into the self is necessary for healing and progressing towards our full potential. As a side note, this is a common theme throughout the Western occult tradition, as well as some of those from the East. The persona. This is our social mask. It can be explored by asking ourselves what we feel is expected of us and how that governs our behavior. The persona is also governed partly by our desire to court those who hold power. Carl Jung proposed that problems happen when we over-identify with one persona rather than many. An overly rigid persona can cause a disconnection with our inner self. He considered the persona and the shadow to be opposites in that the persona is what we look at and the shadow is what we avoid looking at. Anima and animus. The anima is the feminine aspect in men, and the animus is the masculine aspect in women. The gender discussed here is traditional, and it might be easier to understand in a modern context to say that the anima is the reactive nature of an individual, like how an audience reacts to a performer, and the animus is the proactive nature of the individual. Carl Jung proposed that both the anima and animus have a big effect on our close relationships, especially those that involve one individual dominating another. This domination need not necessarily be negative, such as a mother protecting a child. The recognition of this kind of interaction can be the beginning of addressing any interpersonal issues. He believed that owning one's anima or animus can help stabilize the individual emotionally. And here's a quote from Man and His Symbols by Carl Jung. Quote, "My views about the archaic remnants, which I call archetypes or primordial images, have been constantly criticized by people who lack sufficient knowledge of the psychology of dreams and of mythology. The term archetype is often misunderstood as meaning certain definite mythological images or motifs. But these are nothing more than conscious representations. Such variable representations cannot be inherited. The archetype is a tendency to form such representations of a motif, representations that can vary a great deal in detail without losing their basic pattern." The power of reframing. One way that narrative can be harnessed purposefully to help us is through the psychological concept of reframing. Narrative therapist Stephen Madigan says we speak ourselves into meaning. If you'd like the footnotes, please purchase the book. Narrative therapy works from the standpoint that our inner narratives can be negotiated and changed in order to improve mental health. Narratives that are low in meaning or full of negative emotion can harm an individual and should be exchanged, if possible, for narratives that are high in positive meaning. I believe that this effect is part of what is going on in many forms of divination, such as the tarot that I discussed in the previous chapter, especially if the goal is to counsel the querent. In narrative therapy, one seeks to separate a problem from one's identity. Instead of telling oneself, I am a worrier, you would externalize the problem as a separate will. The worry voice is trying to sabotage the situation. Most counseling approaches utilize narrative in one way or another. A friend of mine, James Driver, who is a practicing psychotherapist, has outlined some examples in our conversations. And the following is a quote from an interview that I did with James. For example, if we get anxious in social situations, we might consciously or unconsciously have a narrative that this anxiety is protecting us from rejection. The anxiety makes us nervous, which causes us to hold back from expressing ourselves. As a result, we prevent anyone from judging or criticizing us. However, if we look at this narrative more closely, we see something different. Holding back results in feeling rejected, alone, feeling not good enough, feeling disliked. The anxiety might appear to be protecting us, but instead creates this negative outcome. In a sense, it claims credit for something it is not actually doing. If we can reframe this narrative by recognizing that the anxiety is not helping us, then we have more freedom to act. Rather than seeing the anxiety as a warning of potential rejection, we can instead see it positively as the possibility of being accepted. This reframing of narratives can occur in a range of ways. One example would be a reframing of causality, telling a different story about why something happened. For example, perhaps we made a mistake at work and our boss yelled at us about it. We could easily fall into a narrative like, my boss yelled at me because I'm no good at my job. I always screw up. I'm hopeless. This is a story where a problem happened because of who we are. If we can view this from a different perspective, we can create a more realistic and healthier narrative, such as, my boss yelled at me because she was frustrated about that particular mistake. But in general, I do my job well, and I have had good feedback at other times. This is creating a different story for the cause. In this case, this happened because of what I did, but not because of who I am. Another way would be to say, this happened because my boss was having a bad day. Perhaps the mistake was actually inconsequential. This example excludes both our identity and our actions. We might believe that the purpose of our anxiety is to warn us of a risk of rejection. But on closer examination, we might discover that the purpose in reality is to ensure that we keep feeling the way we always felt, perhaps when we were belittled or dismissed as a child. It serves to maintain that which feels familiar and normal to us. End quote. And that was from a conversation from 2019 that I had with James. As we can see, narrative and roles are core to human memory and identity, and as such, techniques such as reframing can have an enormous power to redirect us. A pragmatic magician should look to narrative as one of the primary tools underpinning magic. Narrative has the power to radically alter the past and the future, to widen our ability to see opportunities to fulfill our will and to protect ourselves from obstacles, dangers, and setbacks. The stories we tell ourselves help determine the way we are treated by other people, the way we feel about ourselves, and therefore, the ways we can act in the world. Thank you very much. If you have enjoyed this content, please consider purchasing my book. Details are in the video description.